The Radio Misfits Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Planted with Sara Payan. I'm Sara Payan, your host, and today we have Dr. Benjamin Caplan on the show. He is the author of the Doctor Approved Cannabis Handbook. I am so excited to hang out with him today and geek out. Ben, welcome. I'm really happy to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
I'm so excited to be here.
Well,
I've heard...
Oh, no, what were you going to say?
I've heard so many of your podcasts, and I love your voice. I love the folks that you have on. I love the message you're getting out there. It's really important, and I'm thrilled to be a part of it.
Oh, thank you. And we've been I've been following you on Twitter for a while, and so I love what you've been putting out there, and I'm just really excited that we get a chance to geek out together today because you have so much knowledge, and I just really appreciate not only the knowledge but the heart that you bring to the subject. So we're going to have some great conversations.
Totally. Looking forward to it.
So, first question, what was your first cannabis experience?
Oof, that's a good one. So a lot of people don't know this about me, but I'm not that much a personal consumer. And my first experience with cannabis, believe it or not, was as a doctor in the suburbs of Boston. I was across the table from some of my patients. It was a family, I think the first one, and they were telling me that they didn't need my medicines, that cannabis was doing what they needed. And I was sitting there, in my own head thinking, wait a minute, everything I've been taught is that cannabis is this gateway thing, that it's, bound for evil, that there's no real medical value, of course, because that's what the government says, and my medical school education. Okay. Fine. I'm going to be polite and sort of respectful of those patients. And it was what it was. I'm not going to push anything on them. Next patient was the same kind of deal. It was a different illness. And they were saying, you know what, cannabis is fine. I don't need this. And it was almost like I was like thinking to myself, are people talking to each other? Am I being punked? And, little by little, these things happen in medicine. Actually, there's like a week where it's all ankle sprains or it's all sore throats. I mean, it's just the coincidence of medicine. But that moment in my career, early on in my career, was enough to lift my eyes and to motivate me to read, is there something really here? Because I didn't know anything about it. And I did what nerdy young medical grads are supposed to do, is I dove into the research and I started being bowled over by all of the studies that were clearly showing cannabis was helping people. But I was never taught that stuff. I was told actually there wasn't enough research out there. I was told the research that was there told us that, we're going to be idiots and drug dealers if we could pursue cannabis. So it was just a welcome slap in the face of reality.
It's an interesting thing because it's like to this day, we have this outmoded view of who a cannabis user is and who can benefit from it. And there's no denying that you can have a bad relationship with any substance, and cannabis is one of those. But the good that it does far outweighs, as long as we have those really balanced conversations about people being in touch with their bodies and what they need, then we can really look at it as something that's therapeutic. Or even, when we look at, recreational or adult use, I think about it where, we have people like, when we get into like youth access and things like that, people are like, oh, what about the children? And I always ask them, I'm like, well, what about, like, I remember when I was in high school and I'm from the woods of the Upper Peninsula where we would have keggers in the woods. And you would always have somebody, not me, because I was a smart girl, but there was always somebody one year that would end up in the hospital getting their stomach pumped because they would have alcohol poisoning. And from a relaxation, recreational view, cannabis by far is a safer alternative for most of us. And so it's just it's an interesting thing that we have the stigma, and even to this day, it's really affecting policy. When I first started working in a dispensary, and, it was like when I was going through chemo, I didn't pay attention to anybody around me. Just came in, got what I wanted, and I left. But working in a dispensary and seeing the wide range of people that were not only using it medicinally, but were also using it for relaxation, which some people would argue is, creating homeostasis and could be considered medical use. Although, your mileage may vary, people differ on their opinion about that. But if our policymakers could understand how outdated their views are, I think we would have a very big change in policy. But I also think with the advent of recreational adult use, we've forgotten about the patients, and we need to have more conversations about medicinal use and accessibility, not only with better pricing for people who are ill because it's not covered by insurance, but more products that actually are geared towards therapeutic use. And so the fact that you're out there as a physician having these conversations is incredibly important.
Thank you. Yeah. I think at this point, I'm more trying to scream them than have conversations, because there's so much need, and it really needs to be heard across the mountaintops. I mean, to your point, we've learned these sort of litanies of misinformation from the professionals in front of us. Doctors, that I still talk to today are kind of so misinformed. And certainly the government, with this Schedule I, that this has zero medical value. It's on par with the worst drugs on earth. That's crazy. But then we also grow up socially. Our parents heard the baloney of the 1930s, that this was the devil's lettuce, that people were going to jump out of, buildings because of it. And this tripartite baloney sandwich that we were kind of just force fed, is a recipe for disaster. There are people out there who are suffering, certainly with serious illnesses and end of life situations, but, cancer, and even as mundane and daily as things like difficulty sleeping and stress and depression and pain, chronic pain. There's so many conditions where cannabis has shown that it's helpful. And in many cases, more helpful than traditional options. We have a culture where we've included some sections of medicines that are behind closed doors, that doctors are the ones who are supposed to be guiding patients with them. We have other medicines where they have patients and the public have free access to them. They call them over the counter because anybody can pick them up. But you know what? In most cases, cannabis is safer than all of those medicines. And yet it's kept behind jail doors. It's lunacy. It doesn't make any sense. And I want to quote a DEA judge from the late 80s. This is Judge Francis Young. In one of his positions back then in the late 80s, the DEA was still dealing with whether cannabis should be legal or not legal or scheduled or whatever. And this is a direct quote from him. He said, "Marijuana, in its natural form, is one of the safest therapeutically active substances known to man. By any measure of rational analysis, marijuana can be safely used within a supervised routine of medical care. It would be unreasonable, arbitrary, and capricious for the DEA to stand between those sufferers and the benefits of this substance in light of the evidence in this record." That's the quote. And that's from a federal judge. This is someone who took information from both sides and adjudicated that the evidence showed unequivocally this was safe.
Yeah, and in that time before that, we had people, brave physicians that were stepping up at the risk of their licenses. And especially I think about doctors like Dr. Todd McArea that cared enough about their patients to put their reputations on the line to actually push this forward. And I think that's the conversations about those people and what they did is something that we have to always highlight and remember their bravery, because if they weren't out there doing that, and if we didn't have the patients stepping out and putting themselves in vulnerable positions, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation today on the podcast. We might be having it over coffee quietly with no one listening, but we wouldn't be putting it out into the ether.
Right.
And it's, I have to say, like, for myself, like, I've always enjoyed cannabis. I was a bit of a precocious child and tried it when I was younger and then stopped, and then off and on as an adult. But the thing that was really impactful for me is before I knew I was sick, I knew I was sick. I was having cyclical vomiting and cramping every time I ate. But I went to go see a gastroenterologist who told me at 37, oh, you have IBS, kind of pat me on the head, I'll see you when you're 50, and gave me smooth muscle relaxants to help with the sickness. And it really, it only worked for a short amount of time, and I would dread eating. And it was a friend of mine who was like, why don't you consider using cannabis and see if that helps? And it just seemed, I'd heard about medicinal use, but at that point in time, I did not take it seriously. It was one of those things where, you smoke a joint and you jokingly say, yeah, it's for my glaucoma. Just like being kind of snide, which now I'm a little embarrassed about. But, I did. And then it was, smoking before eating when I was sick. And all of a sudden, I wasn't in the bathroom like throwing up for hours. And it was, it was amazing. And it was, then they took a tumor the size of a lemon out of me. And I got to actually face that gastroenterologist after chemo and my resectioning, because I did get a second opinion. Mm-hmm. And I told him, I was like, you probably don't remember me, but you saw me a year and a half ago and told me I had IBS. I had stage 3 colon cancer. Please listen to your patients because they're dying. And he went white. And I was like, you gotta, I think that the stuff that we're doing with cannabis and cannabis medicine really shows that integrative medicine is where it's at. And the way that insurance companies treat doctors so that they're more protocol-based and only have so much time with their patients is not working, because people are dying because they don't match, what you think the person who would be having a certain type of illness looks like, is in the age group of, their gender, what have you. And it's a big call to critical thought, especially in medicine, and the fact that it's much more nuanced than maybe the insurance companies or big pharma would like to admit.
Yeah, it's a real entrenched problem. I spend a good part of my day on a doctor social media forum where I'm trying to educate my colleagues, because I think there's a lot of benefit, to be had there. If doctors are getting on board, a lot of other people will be able to have, exposure to a sane way of thinking. But even these doctors today, if you had presented with the vomiting that you described and, you'd had cannabis once in a while, they would say, this is, cannabis hyperemesis, stop your cannabis, this is hurting you, without hearing the full story, which is usually what happens. It's fascinating. The media, if you read at a superficial level, can be really dangerous. Like the media against cannabis, of course, we hear about, these new trips to the ER that are, being found across the country, that people are consuming cannabis or going to the ER because they have too much. And the story sort of ends there, as if that was the end of the world. They don't capture the part of the story where those people are actually perfectly fine. They go home on both legs and they're happy. There's nothing wrong. There's no lasting damage. That part gets left out. Also gets left out that melatonin. There's an interesting paper just last week. The increase in over-the-counter use of melatonin is also causing a lot of ER visits across the country. Yet we don't hear anything about that because it's an over-the-counter substance and we don't have the sort of cultural demonization of melatonin. So I think, we have to be careful about what we're learning, who we're learning from. And, you're quite brave to be able to stand up to people who say something that may not necessarily be true. And I think we have to do what you did and stand up for yourself, what you believe is right. Ask for references, ask for second opinions, find good sources and present those as, sources of information for the people who are making you or helping you make decisions.
Yeah. And I think it can be really difficult when you're scared and confused and in pain. And we look at our physicians, a physician is a big part of our toolkit, and is somebody who is an educator to you. And maybe it's for some people, it's like we look up to our physicians, and we should. I mean, a physician has a lot of information. They're not just there, it's not just some schlub that has an office and is like, yeah, I just feel like helping you today. Yeah, hopefully, hopefully. But it really is about being discerning. And what you were talking about with cannabis hyperemesis, one of my best friends she's a doctor in Colorado, and she's a generalist, and she was working in the ER in like 2013. And she called me and she had mentioned, she's like, tell me what you think of this. I'm having these young men coming into the ER with cyclical vomiting that is only being relieved by hot showers, and I'm not even sure how they figured out that the hot showers were working, and the only thing they have in common is they smoke a lot of weed. And I was just like, at that time I hadn't heard anything about it. I was like, I couldn't tell you. People that I work with use it to help with nausea. But, we still haven't figured out what it is. And the cannabis industry, a lot of people want to pretend. I feel like we have to have a balanced conversation about it because it does a lot of good. But if we don't talk about the things that can possibly come up, that's when we have, I had Michael Steele on the show when we were talking about that Tylenol moment. It's not really that drastic, but, we tend to get a little dramatic sometimes. But it's, it's fodder. If we don't talk about that, it's fodder for people who are anti-cannabis to take that and pull that up and be like, look at this, look at this. It's like, well, we don't know what creates cannabis hyperemesis, but we know it exists. We know that some people have sensitivities to CBD, but by and large, that's not the case. We know that, it doesn't cure COVID. Like when we have, because it seems like there's a lot of our colleagues out there that will say all these things that it I remember when CBD started becoming very popular, and I am a fan of it. I use a ratio to help with my peripheral neuropathy, but they're like, oh, it'll do everything. And so I'd always joke, it's like my big fat Greek wedding and the Windex, it'll wash your car, it'll save your marriage, it'll do all these things. And it's like, these are all wonderful substances. But let's have some realistic conversations on what it can and can't do, and the fact that one size does not fit all is very nuanced. And when we're looking at dosages, like when I work with professionals and do trainings, they'll be like, Sara, my patient has blah, blah, blah. What's the dosage and the ratio that you would recommend? And I always say to them, that's not how it works. Mm-hmm. We know how the majority of human beings respond. We start from there, and then your goal as a medical professional is to figure out the correct ratio at the lowest volume that creates a desired reaction in the body. And when you're talking to pharmacology students, you're like, and that because when, a doctor, and you tell me, Ben, but when a doctor makes, a recommendation, when you actually, tell somebody to use a certain pharmaceutical and you write out a script for them, you watch them and you see how they react so that you can adjust dosage, correct?
Yes, of course. Of course. My thought is, we now have a cannabis culture that's approached cannabis crawling into it from a defensive perspective. The go low and go slow mentality, which you alluded to, the sort of find the lowest therapeutically active dose. Is a right heuristic for when people don't know what's going on. And there are circumstances like with cancer, actually, where I make an argument in the book, which is very different than go low and go slow. It's, to be informed, understand what the evidence is, who's had success with what choices in an organized way, not which friend of yours had a good result. But,
right.
When we look at a public health perspective, when we have access to thousands of patients, if not more of data, what are they showing us is working, at a scientific level? And in some cases, it's actually almost the opposite of go low and go slow. There's a section of the book, the cancer chapter, that I'd love to read if it's okay. It's just
please.
Kind of a sentence or two, but it's exactly talking about this. And it's under the cannabis chapter under regimens for cannabis treatment, for cancer treatment. Cannabis appears to work by influencing the right tone. To do so, it is believed that a large volume of cannabis is needed to achieve this tonal change and make a lasting difference. if there are 10,000 pieces of cancer, it appears that you may need at least 10,000 pieces of cannabis to interact with localized cancer cells. So that's an example of low and slow is not going to achieve that level of impact. And, from the patients I've seen and the patients I interview for the book, the high dose cannabis that they require has in some cases saved their lives.
Mm-hmm.
It's not subtle, it's not low, and it's really an impressive thing, for me to watch and then be able to share.
Yeah, and that is very different than using it for symptom management. And that's what people need to understand. Because if you're using it for symptom management, it's a much more subtle process. Some people who have a lot of pain management issues may have to use higher dosage as well. But the thing that people need to understand with using it for cancers and cancer protocols is that it is a large amount, but you don't want to do it on your own because there are protocols for the different types of cancers. So you want to work with somebody who's well versed with that. And what do you think? Like when we look at that, I've talked to a lot of researchers and physicians about this, and before people used to, and it changes. It changes. Like before, people are like, well, if you can't take large amounts of cannabinoids, you can always use a suppository. And now people are like, no, that doesn't work. It has to be ingested for it to be, active and really do the job that it needs to do, especially because we're looking to create natural cell death in the body. And that takes a lot of cannabinoids, and it will be certain, loads of cannabinoids for certain types of cancers, and also taking into consideration the individual. But what are your thoughts on that?
I generally give people 3 buckets to think about. The first is symptom management. If someone's comfortable with their chemotherapy or they've had success in the past, they don't need to think about cannabis as a chemotherapeutic agent, but they want to feel less nauseous, or they want to sleep better, or they want to be less stressed out, or maybe they just want to zone out for a while, take a vacation from life while they're going through this suffering. There are doses of cannabis where that's more appropriate, and they tend to be lower, tends to be more THC than CBD, but of course everybody's a little different. And then another bucket are people that sort of we're alluding to, which is people who are frustrated with the traditional options or haven't had success with them, or want something that's even more powerful. They still want to use traditional choices, but they want to augment that with whatever guns they can find. And for those people, the dose is very different. And like you said, this stuff has to be personalized. We don't tell you go do exercise. If I were an exercise specialist or a professional athlete coach, I'm not going to tell my athlete, go do exercise. I'm going to give very specific choices, very specific routines, and help follow up and see how that's going and adjust as needed. Cannabis is very much like exercise or like nutrition in that sense, that it's personalized. It reflects what the person is born with, what their environment is, what their needs are, what they're dealing with in terms of illness or skill set. And I don't know why we would ever treat cannabis as different than that. I think some people try to fit cannabis into the traditional model, like you need to take a certain dose, and that dose is going to work for every white 70-kilogram man on earth. And that's how medicine is sort of borne out in the literature. And at this point, from modern medicine's perspective, that's a crazy model. And over time, we've realized that, hey, wait a minute, African American skin may not conduct oxygen, may not conduct light the same way that white skin does. And maybe the way that we check oxygenation for African American skin is different than white skin. And that's something we learned with a modern perspective. And I think we're going to look back on the way cannabis has been spoken about, has been described in a very similar concept. That this should be personalized. Your endocannabinoid system is different than mine, and it needs different stuff.
Yeah. That's fascinating too that you mentioned that, because I never knew that. I mean, we're all so different. The subtleties are amazing. And then when we're looking at, cancer therapies and cannabis, I really feel like we have to have when we're looking at the new lexicon for cannabis as we grow, looking at it and really impressing upon patients that it's a therapy. It's not a cure. Like radiation is a therapy. Chemotherapy is a therapy. It's even got it in the name. Because when you're sick, and this is especially around things like cancer and other devastating diseases and illnesses, people, and a lot of them are the most well-meaning, come out of the woodwork trying to sell you magic beans, and we don't want cannabis to be grouped in that. It's like managing expectations around it. Because like you said, there are a lot of people who have turned to cannabis therapy who have survived as a result of their work with it. And there are people who have tried it, and whether it's been because it was too late or they were working with somebody who was not able to find them the correct combination of cannabinoids, have not. But for those of us who have worked with a lot of people or have talked to a lot of researchers, we know that it does create cell death. Like Dr. Christina Sanchez actually has a picture of THC, killing a cancer cell, and also disseminating for people what that means, because it's not the same as chemotherapy. Chemotherapy does not discern between cancer cells and healthy cells, and cannabis is actually giving these cells a signaling that they need to have that natural cell death. And I think people don't really understand what's all behind that. And I get it, because it's not really their job to, but we have to have more conversations about that so that they understand. Because I can't tell you how many times when I worked in a dispensary, there was just somebody who just they should have been spending their money on talking to that specialist that helps them with it, instead of being in the dispensary and just saying, just load me up. Like, I'm just desperate and I'll take whatever. It's like, no, put down the noni juice, put down the syringe of RSO, go talk to a professional who's actually, done the work and has worked with a lot of people and sees, the full landscape of what's going on, so that they can help you, instead of it's almost like you're just fiddling around in the dark hoping for the best.
Yeah. It's a strange double-edged sword about the internet, that each of us, depending on your surfing skills, feels like we're a master of all, because you have access to all this information. Leave aside that not everybody understands what they're reading or can kind of read between the lines. But with that in mind, I wrote the Doctor Approved Cannabis Handbook to be cutting for everybody. I included in the book 3 charts that peel apart all of the cannabinoids that are accessible in the market, all the terpenes that are accessible, and all the flavonoids.
I loved that. I saw that. I was totally geeking out on it.
And there are studies that show for each particular molecule what the possibilities are for medical benefit. And people just need that information. They go to the stores and they see lab reports for a product they might be interested in buying, but they don't know what that means. How does that impact me? Which ones, might be helping me relieve anxiety? Which ones might help kill cancer cells? And where is the evidence for that? That's what this book sort of consolidates in hopefully a digestible way. Because I think there are very few options out there for understanding. People are faced with a bud tender, who's very well-meaning and usually very personally experienced, and they collect whatever information they can from the people they see, but they don't know how to translate that. They don't know how to translate that into medicine and what might help the person in front of them. But sadly, there aren't that many clinicians out there yet either, which is a real strange predicament. A lot of doctors are not reading the published literature. They're reading the things that support their views.
Right.
And like all good science, there are views on both sides. There are papers that show cannabis does X, but you know what? There are papers that show cannabis does not X. And just, the other day, I came across this paper that was just recently published, a twin study about over 4,000 twins. And it looked at the effects of cannabis dosage on what they can do cognitively. Is this really making people dumber? And it showed actually very little effect between people that consumed once a year and every day. between the twins. It's a really interesting study because all of us kind of have this idea that, oh, wait a minute, cannabis is going to make me dumb or it's going to reduce my IQ. There were those studies that came out in the 80s and 90s.
Right.
But the truth is, there's another view that tells a very different story.
Right. And we could also have the conversation about it being a neuroprotective, especially when we're looking at CBD ratios. Like, I was at Patients Out of Time in 2015, presented there, and there was a researcher that did this amazing presentation on the neuroprotective qualities of CBD ratios and people going through treatment that may create peripheral neuropathy. And I thought, geez, I wish I knew that when I was going through treatment. And when I got back to San Francisco and I was working with some doctors and their patients and I mentioned it, I said, there's this research that's come out about, starting before you go into your chemotherapy treatment, during chemotherapy, and then for the 3 to 4 days afterwards when you have, active pharmaceuticals in your system, the chemicals are still there. And they were saying that people either were experiencing neuropathy later in their cycles, people were bouncing back better, and some people weren't getting it at all. And of course, when we look at, things like peripheral neuropathy and chemotherapy, your mileage may vary as well. Because I know for me, they told me, by your third round, you should start feeling it. I felt it my first. Like I couldn't drink anything besides warm water. But I mentioned it to the doctors and I said, it's something that you might want to take into consideration and understand, and then a doctor may not understand CBD, but they understand a cytochrome P450 interaction. So just keep that in mind because I have no idea about the pharmaceuticals that you're working with your patients, but you know that. And there were a lot of patients that came back and they said it was really helpful and that they weren't dealing with peripheral neuropathy after treatment because of that. And it's like, sometimes like it takes that for like a physician to get looped in and be like, oh, wow, that really was helpful. And so the thing that for some of us who are into the science and research more and aren't physicians, it's almost like being a navigator to help doctors understand in their terms how things might work so that they get curious enough to go beyond that and do the work that's definitely like in their wheelhouse and we have no business having conversations about, and it's exciting to see. And it's exciting, especially to see you doing this work because, you're their colleague and you have that background and, conversations normalization, but even more so around people who do work together that are on this, are sharing the same knowledge base and are colleagues. That collegial interaction is what creates better conversations and really opens it up for, as we start looking at rescheduling, even more research to be able to help people.
For sure. It's a hard mission though, I'll tell you, because I get so excited by some of the patients I see. It's really kind of crazy. There's an example of a woman I saw who had neural sheath tumors. These are sort of protective sheaths around your fingers. And they were growing and really scaring and painful for her. She and I figured out a routine of topicals. Long story short, it ended up disappearing. Her neural sheath tumors disappeared.
Wow.
And it's interesting because those things actually do disappear on their own naturally sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a scientific question, which is, was this really the cannabis? Was it just sort of self-resolving? But at the time I did some digging, as I always do with these puzzles. And I discovered literature that's already out there, but wasn't taught to me and isn't widely known. Cannabis topicals can stimulate stem cells that live beneath the top layers of skin, subdermal stem cells. And we have a culture that's sort of up in arms about, the babies and even abortion has gotten in there because of the stem cells that we derive from babies and cord blood and all this stuff. But imagine if we had a plant that we knew about that was stimulating stem cells. So we talk about nerve damage and peripheral neuropathy, and it's certainly known that cannabis affects nerves in a way that does support healing from damage. It also supports protection from outside stimuli that might be aversive, might be bad for the nerves. But we also see that some of the cells that we thought were impenetrable, that we couldn't stimulate regrowth, that we were mistaken, that there are natural substances out there. There are compounds that we could apply to the skin, which will help people regenerate damaged tissue. And I've used these formulations now with people that have vitiligo, which is an autoimmune disorder that gets rid of pigment in the skin in certain places. And that's currently a dermatologic condition that we don't have much control over. Many of these people are advised by their dermatologists to wear makeup so that they're, feeling more comfortable about it, but not affecting any real change. And I've seen some improvement in some of these vitiligo patients. I have other patients with acne, and they use the cannabis topicals on acne because the other acne medicines they've used don't work, and they have success. I mean, that's a whole different bucket of worms here, because cannabis actually does have antibiotic properties as well. But you can see even sort of as these things bubble up in my own mind, I get so excited because there aren't good choices out there in the pharmaceutical world. And to have one plant that can produce these different substances that have real useful activity is just so exciting. But I also realize it sounds like I'm a wacko, because it's there's so much there. And for me to really understand them and share them, my God, this does seem like snake oil. It seems like magic.
Well,
but the truth is it's not. And
right.
The analogy I landed on was, if you could picture going to CVS or Rite Aid, Walgreens, and jumping behind the pharmaceutical counter, if you could pull all of those pills into a big blender, cannabis is a natural pharmacy like what would be in that blender. There's a substance in there that does X for skin. There's a substance that does Y for your sleep. It's not all one molecule. And I think the cannabis industry feels like THC or CBD are the magic agents, and they do a lot of good, but there's so much else in there that does other kinds of good. So it's not really just one thing here.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And I don't think you sound crazy. I think you sound very balanced.
Thank you.
And I kind of, will you go on a little weird deep dive with me?
Sure, please. Dive away.
So, when we look at, I think that people would think that wouldn't think it was so strange if they actually understood that we have an endocannabinoid system and how very much connected it is to our nervous system. And one thing that I've noticed through the years, and please correct me if I'm wrong, if you've observed something else, but more and more people are having issues with autoimmune disease. And a lot of them are very hard to treat, and a lot of the things that we're using are actually pharmaceuticals to mask a lot of the symptoms. A lot of these people are actually getting more relief, and some of them are actually being, and I don't want to say healed, but they aren't having issues with them when they find the regimen of cannabinoids that work well for their bodies. But I also wonder, because some of the strangest cases of autoimmune disease that I've noticed are also coming from people who have had severe trauma earlier in their lives. And that affects the nervous system, and our nervous system fires off, and we are a weird chemical cocktail walking around on this earth as it is. But a lot of those emotions, whether they're expressed or repressed, also create chemical reactions that impact the body. So when we're looking at the ECS, our nervous system, and cannabinoids, perhaps that's where we need to go to help create homeostasis, to help these people heal, so that they're not exhibiting these symptoms of these autoimmune issues, which can be things like thyroid issues, or even like my mother was talking about the fact that, for some people going through significant trauma later on in life, certain cancers can even be expressed. Because as a researcher, she said that what they think is that we all have cancers in our bodies. It's just whether or not they're activated by, and they're not sure, like some of it's environmental, some of it's internal, some of it's genetic, but it all comes together in a really weird way and manifests itself. And so when we And there are researchers that say that the reason that we didn't deal with a lot of this earlier in life was, one, life was simpler. We didn't have as many, outside environmental things that were coming into play, but also hemp was part of the feed for some of the animals that were growing. And so we were actually ingesting cannabinoids, just as mothers who are breastfeeding are giving their children anandamide through their breast milk. So if we had more access to cannabinoids, whether we were ingesting it ourselves or we were getting it through a food source that had ingested it or had metabolized it somehow, that we would have more access to homeostasis in our lives.
Yeah, no, totally. A lot of people may not understand the endocannabinoid system, that this is something we're all born with. We always have been born with it. And it is the most prolific communication system in the body. We've heard of dopamine and noradrenaline. We've heard of serotonin. But cannabis, the endocannabinoid system, some of these molecules are naturally there and much more profound in every cell of our body. And this isn't just the plant. The plant is a substitute for that from the natural world, but all of us are born with that, as you alluded, right into mother's breast milk. People also don't know that throughout available archaeological history, cannabis, the plant, has been deeply associated with human culture for 12,000 years. This has always been part of the human experience. I make the analogy in the book about panda bears and bamboo. Like imagine a panda without bamboo, that's their food source. Or imagine a koala without eucalyptus, or a monarch butterfly without milkweed. Like those are the plants for that animal. And why would we think that humans roaming the earth, smart as we were, relative to the animal kingdom around us, why would we not latch on to a plant that was really healthy for us and plentifully grown? I mean, cannabis can grow in almost any environment.
Right.
Why would humans not latch on to that as a really consistent part of our diet? And if people understand then that cannabis is one of the strongest anti-inflammatory agents we have, during COVID, when people had this autoimmune storm, it's called a cytokine storm, they were given steroid therapies in the hospital. And cannabis as a medicine fights this cytokine storm. In some studies, many, many times stronger than steroids. So this is a powerful anti-inflammatory. And if I carry the analogy through, so this has been part of human history. Humans have always been consuming it, and it was a very strong anti-inflammatory. If in modern day, when the last 100 years we've been forbidden for having cannabis because of the government and racial biases and all kinds of silliness, if we all of a sudden have a culture of humans without cannabis, what would we expect to see? Oh, autoimmunity, where the body's immune system is overacting because it doesn't have this natural balancing agent. So it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I can connect those dots pretty easily, not knowing much about archaeology and not knowing much about, sort of paleobotany. But I can tell you for sure that the people I see who have autoimmunity, from diabetes to, as you mentioned, Graves' disease, thyroid disease, hypothyroidism, I've seen them get better. I've seen people, as we were talking about before, with vitiligo get better. And I can't explain that except for the autoimmune buffering, the anti-inflammatory effects of cannabis. You mentioned something really brilliant in there, which was about trauma and how can trauma affect people. And, just like we feel warm and safe with a mother's kiss when we feel, in harm's way or not good about ourselves, stress is a real thing. And when people feel stressed out about their daily lives or in relationships that aren't going well or jobs that aren't going well, that stress has physical effects. We know that through the adrenocorticosteroid system, the cortisol system that people might be familiar with. That is really damaging. And if you have an agent which you could take, which is natural and can help combat that stressful system, you're going to have a balance of stress, which happens in your life, and something which undoes the stress or helps you unwind. And that can be a really healthy mixture. So it doesn't have to be magic. It just makes perfect sense with what we know about biology.
Well, we look at that because that is something that, and when I'm on social media, I see this all the time, and I'm like, I think that people have been really thinking about it, especially because of what we've been through in the past few years. But I'm seeing a lot of posts about people having high cortisol levels and how that manifests in the body and creates, exhaustion, brain fog, people gaining weight, especially in their midsection, and the impact that it has on the heart. If somebody wanted to use cannabis to help with their cortisol levels, what's a conversation you'd have with them about that?
Good question. So I lay that all out in the book, and I want people to have this knowledge, whether you read it or hear it here. I think there are essentially 4 decisions now to make at a dispensary. These 4 decisions will change as the dispensaries mature, as the industry matures. But right now, you get to think a lot about you and what you want, and then match that to what cannabis is available. The market is going to change. Different things are available at any given day. But first, you got to think about what you want. And the first decision is timing. Some products work right away. If you're stressed out, if you're pulling your hair out, you can't deal with another moment, there are products that can get you relief immediately. That's a different set of products than a cushion through the whole day. If you're someone who's just constantly stressed out, you're not happy with your everyday life, you want a cushion through the whole day, that's a different set of products than the stuff which is working instantly. So decision number 1 is about timing. What works best for you? Decision number 2 is about alteration. Some people are comfortable feeling joy, feeling happiness. They'll take a doctor saying happiness is the best medicine, or laughter is the best medicine, but they won't take that to real medicine. And some people think, no, I don't want to be altered. I just want something that keeping me level, just not making me feel happier than I'm comfortable feeling, whatever that means. So alteration is decision number 2. Decision number 3 is basically what the industry is oriented around, this indica sativa thing. There are mixtures of plant stuff which help you feel activated, energized, stimulated, like coffee would in the morning, a little pep in your step. There are also mixtures which do the opposite. It's much more calming, relaxing, sort of sleepy medicine. And then, of course, there's combinations of these two which are neutral. And the industry has kind of advertised that to the public as something that's an upper, something that's right in the middle called a hybrid, and something that's not a downer, but something that's calming called an indica product. The reality of biology is that those things don't exist, that you could take an indica plant, grow it in a different environment, or supply different nutrients to the plant and get a completely different set of enzymes and completely different set of products out of that plant. But suffice it to say, there are these 3 categories. That's a decision someone has to make. Do you want a product for the morning time that's going to give you energy, or I guess through the rest of the day, or do you want something that's going to be more calming and help you feel relaxed? The 4th decision and last one is the amplitude of all of these things. How much of an instant effect do you want? How much of a daytime versus a nighttime product do you want? How much of joy or alteration do you want? Because you can dial it up or dial it down on any of these decisions too. With that matrix, if you think about your preferences in those categories, that's a conversation you can have with a bud tender or a store clerk saying, hey, you know what? I want something that's going to work for a really long time. I want something that's not going to alter me at all. I want to feel sober through the day. And you know what? I want something that can help me relax. That is a choice that they can understand and they can interpret without needing to know your medical conditions, without needing to give you medical advice.
Right. That's the thing. It's really looking at, I know people get frustrated because there are a lot of people who don't have a resource like you. And so they do look at their bud tender as their healthcare counselor, but they're navigators. They're navigators. That's all. They can help you navigate the products. Hopefully they're trained well enough to do that. And I say that because there are some really thoughtful, geeky bud tenders out there that know full well that they're not healthcare providers, but they can give you information for you to do experimentation and also give you the information to go back to your physician with so that they know what's going on. Because it's always important if you can have that conversation with them to do that. Physicians that I've worked with say that they always learn so much from having those conversations with their patients and learning about the outcomes. And a lot of times it makes them, like what you had with your patients in the beginning, very much more curious about delving into the science so that they can really help their patients with this. And I think that that's a super, super important, conversation to have. I also think, as somebody who has trained many bud tenders through the years, and the people I worked with were anomalies because we had a very different culture at the dispensary that we were there during the medicinal days. And so there weren't a lot of doctors that would even have the conversations, and even less that would verify the recommendations that they wrote out for their patients because of fear. And so we were put in a very precarious position. But, we were really well trained with all of this, and then knowing full well we weren't healthcare providers was a very important conversation to have. And now when I go to dispensaries, and it's not all, so you bud tenders listening out there that are engaged, please know that I'm not dogging on you, but there are a lot of people out there who are behind the counter and it's just a job and they don't understand anything about it. And, I always think 8+ hours of your life, how can you do that? But, for some people it's just a job. But a well-educated bud tender should be able to steer you towards your needs without diagnosing you, without doing anything, you having to disclose any medical information. You just need to look within and disseminate, like, what is it that I need as far as relief so that I can put it in layman's terms for somebody to be able to help me. And know that, there are... when I always talk about like window of relief, like what's your window of relief? How long do you need it to last? Some people don't metabolize edibles. I was shocked to see, like, as more and more people are using cannabis, the things that we thought were anomalies still kind of are, but they actually affect a much larger group than we thought. Like CBD sensitivity. Like I started hearing about people getting really amped up on CBD or having a general malaise after using it. And I used to think it was a one-off, or like in the thousands of people that I've worked with, I've had 4 that have had, they said that they tripped out on 30-to-1 ratios of CBD to THC. And then you got to wonder, like, talking to researchers, like what's going on with their nervous system that has them doing that. And with the edibles, researchers are saying it has something to do with liver function. Have you heard anything about that? About the metabolizing?
Sure. Yeah, no, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned sort of a lens through which to look, which is magnified by the numbers of people. I've had the fortune of overseeing close to 285,000 patients. So I collect data on the people I see. That's one of the reasons I feel confident talking about cannabis is because I've seen it play out. An interesting study I did internally was, of the people who I initially saw maybe 10 years ago who told me that edibles didn't work for them, I went back to them and I invited them to try really high dose edibles in the tune of 200 to 300 milligrams. And 85% of them felt effects from that dosage. So it's actually not a total inability for them to process edibles or for them to feel it. It's just a magnitude. Which is really interesting. I think, to your point, there's a lot we still have to learn. And we are all learning a lot. And, I would go toe to toe with any bud tender saying I know less than anybody. And the more that I learn, the more I realize I know almost nothing. There's so much here to unpack. And, the real perspective I've gained is cannabis is just a microcosm of all of nature. Right. There's a lot we don't know about nature. And we're learning about all the plants out there. I mean, it's arguable that many plants we haven't even discovered yet. So there's this whole treasure of natural medicines that cannabis exemplifies. It's sort of a microcosm of all of these natural compounds. And people have access to that. We should have access to that. Right now, 51% of the American population lives in a state with access to cannabis. But having access to the plant, being a grown-up and buying it on your own is not enough. You really need to know what you're doing. You need to know what you are, who you are, what your needs are, but also what the plant is offering you and what the right match is. And that's the point of the Doctor Approved Cannabis Handbook. I wanted to give people the keys to understand it, to understand themselves, understand the market, understand the illnesses that get better with it and why, that discussion is right accessible for everybody.
It's an invaluable tool to have. And when you were mentioning that the higher dosages were helping people who weren't metabolized or weren't getting any effects from your normal everyday dose edibles, that is a very, I mean, when we look at from a policy standpoint, policy is not necessarily based on fact. It's based on state culture and stigma. And I know you've probably heard me say that again and again. But it's a really good argument to when they talk about, we don't need these high dosage edibles. What about the children? And whenever that comes up, I'm like, how about teaching adults to store their cannabis correctly so that the children don't have access to it? Let's talk about that. Or when I've talked to people, especially that are doing research and policy about THC taxation, like, oh, we're gonna tax higher percentages of THC. And telling them, that's just incorrect, because first off, you can have a really functional high THC cultivar, and you can have something that's lower in THC with a really interesting terpene profile that feels much stronger than what the percentage of THC is. But the people who benefit the most from the high THC percentages are the people who are using it for pain management. So you're actively working against a group of people that are looking to use it for symptom management. And they're also the people that are the reason that we're here today and that we're actually in this era of legalization. And I think they just don't get it.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's enough misinformation to go around, and, talk about regulation getting things wrong. There are thousands of pounds of crops that are simply trashed, burned, because they measure more than 0.3% THC. And that might be simply because they picked the wrong day to cultivate that product. I mean, cannabis is a dynamic plant. It grows with different percentages according to the day you happen to be cutting it. And the regulation system has no idea. And they say they sort of have these artificial cutoffs as if 0.3% is enough, THC for whatever they think it's useful for or not useful for. But it just completely ignores the reality of this medicine and this plant and the industry growing it.
What conversations are you having with your patients about hemp products? It's one of those things that in our industry is widely maligned. But I think that I'm going to just say something before I know I'm like, ooh, and Ben, let's talk about this. But I feel like there's a lot of stigma around it, and it's because we do have people who are bad players in the industry. But I think that painting with a wide brush is very unwise. And I'd love to hear what you think about that and what you talk to your patients about regarding that, especially in areas where they may not have access to legal cannabis dispensaries, but they do have access to hemp products.
Sure. I mean, so the book title that is massively long, and part of that is to enable people to find it on search engines. But the end of the title is Reverse Disease, Treat Pain, and Enhance Your Wellness with Medical Marijuana and CBD. So I actually cover that in half of the book. I want people to have access because each of us is a mixture. I guess if we're all chickens, we're white meat and dark meat. And we have different receptors that we're born with. And some people respond better to THC products. Some people respond better from an anti-inflammatory perspective to CBD. Different cells respond to different compounds. It's important to get to know you. I mean, that's half of this puzzle is who are you? What does your body respond well with? The other half is to find those products that are safe to consume, that are non-toxic, that are available. And then how do you match the two? What's the ratio that you use? What's the mixture that you use for why? Do you have a whole medicine cabinet of different products? There's a lot to learn here. And not one product is going to work for everybody. And there might be 5 products that are better. And there might be one product for a Wednesday and one product for a Saturday night. And that's okay. That's normal variability, diversity in life. So I think it's a no-brainer that cannabis is a mixture and it has to mix and match with a very diverse population that's consuming it.
And what are tips that you give people who are looking for hemp products just to make sure that they're they're finding an effective, safe product in the market.
So dosage becomes the real question when you're focusing on only one cannabinoid. So if we're focusing on CBD, what is 1 milligram of CBD? What is 10 milligrams? What is 25? What is 150 milligrams of CBD going to do for you? And what value do you see there? And I put full charts in the book so that people could grasp that and really understand where they might fit, what they might want, whether it's a Wednesday or a Saturday night. My general observation is that people consume way too little CBD, that the products out there in the market are sold in 5 milligram aliquots, sometimes 25 milligram aliquots, whether it's a gummy or a pill or whatever. The evidence that supports treatment of stress, of anxiety, is upwards of 150 milligrams and sometimes twice a day. So people are way off. And that's partly because the producers out there who are selling these products don't know themselves. They're not reading the literature. It's also certainly true that the buying public, sees CBD on the label and they think, oh, it's all the same. It doesn't matter how much it is. And then also, unfortunately, there's the baggage of, oh gosh, a little cannabis might be bad, but boy, big doses of cannabis must be worse. And there's this whole kind of mixture. It's a perfect, horrible mixture of misinformation that just really fights against people having success. So my job, as I see it now, as a clinician, is to cut through that baloney, to help people see the truth and what's helping, what's not helping, and to do it in a way that people don't have to trust me, actually. There are 300 plus pages of this book, 119 claims. Every single claim has a peer-reviewed reference right in the back. I don't want people to take my word for it. I'm showing people the scoreboard. Look at it yourself. The evidence is right there. You don't need me to tell it to you, although I am explaining it and translating all the science so that everybody understands.
It's such a balanced way of giving the information for people. I think it's incredibly important. Everything that we're doing with cannabis, whether we're talking about medicinal use, politics, business, I think it's an invitation for us to revisit looking at the world through a critical lens and critical thought. And I really, really appreciate the work that you're doing to get out there and have those conversations and help people find the relief that they need. Because it's heartbreaking to hear about people using things like, and I'm not saying it doesn't have a place, but ibuprofen for pain management, and then hearing them talk about having stomach bleeds. When we talk about, people get afraid about cannabis, but even things that we use over the counter can do harm if we're not using them correctly. And really recording that. How do you talk to your patients about recording their impressions so that they can come back and tell you what's going on?
I started a whole company actually about guidance. I co-founded a company called EO Care. And it was initially through an app that people could find recommendations that were personalized to their schedule and their needs. And you wouldn't actually have to record, but to say how it was feeling. Are you feeling well today? Is this working? Is this not working? And the app, this whole company, was managing that information and guiding you accordingly. If things weren't going well, we would make adjustments behind the scenes and you'd have a better result. So I think anytime that someone can pay attention to what their experience is and feed it back, whether it's to a therapist, to even a bud tender, to their friends, talk about things, your own internal dialogue and your own perspective might be altered, might not be telling you a clear picture. And if you want a lasting result, you got to process that, not just internally, but also externally. Ideally, we'll have a time soon when clinicians are informed, that primary care doctors and specialists are knowledgeable about cannabis. They've seen some patients in the past and followed those patients to learn enough to be able to guide someone in front of them. That's unfortunately a long way off right now. We don't have that many clinicians who are confident and have experience to be able to guide people. So I think right now, I don't know. I mean, I make myself available to patients that want me kind of wherever they can find me, in social media and in my own clinic, of course. But I think people have to do whatever they can right now to make themselves knowledgeable and unfortunately help themselves as much as they can, engage the people around them. But you have to be wary that, a lot of the professionals have been eating the same bologna sandwich that we were. as regular people.
And talking about things that are happening, going towards a future, what are you hopeful for? What are you excited about?
My vision one day is we're going to have a sort of cosmetic line of cannabis, and it's going to be so many different colors. In the cannabis analogy, would probably be different flavors, different scents, different effects, and people will be able to pick the effect and the medicine they really want for their illness. I love how free the current market is. Right now, as an adult, you can go into a cannabis store and buy whatever product you want. You are the pharmacist, basically. You can ask for some advice, but you don't have to. You can really jump behind the pharmacy counter, grab whatever things you want, and take them any way you want. I think that is exciting from a freedom perspective. I love that people have the agency and can be the masters of their own fate. But like we were saying before, that takes humility to understand that you need some knowledge to make that work well. Anybody can throw spaghetti on the wall and hope it sticks. But if you want something that's lasting and effective and really going to do what you want it to do, you have to engage with someone who's an expert or at least has experience enough to guide you. So I think the future will be a wonderfully diverse free market for products that people can pick from. And my hope is that people will be informed, that they'll see that they want to learn more and maybe see that they benefit from learning more. At the very least, in terms of cost, when people are more efficient about their consumption, they don't throw away stuff that didn't work as much. They don't buy random products that are costing a lot of money. When you learn, it's not just kind of for better medicine, it's also to save you money. People who come to me, my clinic charges more than some of the local clinics. And people ask me, why do you do that? You're going to lose business if you're not dropping your dollar for charging people. And I'm training my patients to be the experts in their own care. That takes important level of skill. It also saves them a lot of money. So many people go to the quote unquote medical cannabis doc and they just get a card, and that's not the experience of medicine. Cannabis medicine is learning about the material, learning what it does for you, how it can be changed over time. There's a real science. There's the specialty, just like a dermatologist or an orthopedist. So I think I see also the future of medicine, the future of cannabis, as involving a creation of a cannabis specialty. And hopefully I'll have a part of that. I'm sure working hard to make it that way.
That's exciting. That's exciting stuff. And it's another thing I think that comes out of it too is that call to, in this crazy world where we're rushing from moment to moment, we're constantly distracted and kind of we're like living almost an out of body experience because of all the stimuli in our lives. I think that when people do take that time to advocate for themselves and search out the solutions, it's also a call to grounding and being aware of our bodies, and that everything we put in our bodies creates a reaction. Totally with you. For people who want to follow you on social media, and I know you had mentioned that you have some great resources online, how would they do that?
So for people who want to connect personally, I have a personal website. It's Benjamin Caplan. My name is with a C, Benjamin Caplan, Caplan.com. I'm all over socials. So Twitter is at DrCaplan. That's at Dr. Caplan. Instagram is at Dr. Benjamin Caplan. And then for people that are interested in more of a professional clinical relationship, my clinic is cedclinic.com. Cat, elephant, dog, clinic.com. The book, of course, is everywhere books are sold. Amazon has it. I also have a website that I built which allows people to compare cannabis against over-the-counter medicines, against traditional pharmaceutical medicines. There's stuff in there about what stages of sleep cannabis impacts or what kinds of pain cannabis can help with and what formulations. I lay it out as much as I can for free. That website is Caplan Cannabis. So it's Caplan, Caplan, and cannabis.com. But I'm all out there. Anybody wants to reach out, I'm really not that hard to find. I'm trying to get everybody on the same page, whether you're a professional, whether you're a doctor, whether you're a man, woman, or something else. We're all here together. We're fighting on this planet to try to help each other. So here's me doing what I can, in my small box. I'm so glad you are. It really, like Dr. Caplan, it's like I've been going between Ben and Dr. Caplan. I feel like we're getting to know each other, and this is so awesome. Yeah. But it's a pleasure to have you here. These conversations are so important to have, and as somebody who is,
who's dedicated and dialed into human health. You are one of the people who should be leading these conversations. So thank you so much. And I really look forward to our future conversations because I think we have a lot more to geek out on.
I know, right? I can't believe it's been so long. We could talk for hours. This is really wonderful. Thank you for spending so much time.
Absolutely. We definitely have to do it again.
Sounds great. Looking forward to it.
Until next time. And everyone, remember, if you like listening, please give us a review, share it with a friend. Let us know what your favorite episodes are. And if you'd like to stay in touch over social media, we are Planted with Sara Pion on Facebook and Planted with Sara on Instagram and Twitter. You can also go to our website, www.plantedwithsara.com, or listen to us on our parent network, Radio Misfits Network, where there are other great podcasts, like one of my favorites, the Winemakers Podcast. So check it out. You can listen to Planted wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, whether that's Pandora, Spotify, Amazon, Google, Apple, Stitcher. Tune in. We are there. So join us. And until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, it's a wild world out there. Be good to one another. Until next time, take care.